Hello, everyone. It's Alex Patel, and so I decided to start a podcast about current events. So the format I'm going to try to do with this podcast is cover 3 general topics regarding current events, probably once a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, for about an hour, and that time is definitely subject to change. So for today's podcast, on Sunday, September 22nd, 2013, I want to cover 3 key topics. The first one is going to be Syria, which is an international crisis. The second one, I want to be talking about mass shootings, and more specifically, the one that occurred at the Navy Yard just recently. And I was actually living in the city of Washington, D.C., so it has a little bit of a personal touch on me, if you will. And the third one is going to be the debt ceiling and things in that area. So we're going to start off with Syria for a little bit. So I'd imagine most of my listeners right now probably have some grasp on the Syrian crisis. What's going on is essentially a civil war between the government under Bashar al-Assad and the rebels. But let me give you some quick facts, some things you might not know, or popular misconceptions. Number one, about the rebels. The rebels are more of a ragtag alliance rather than a unified force. There's this misconception that it's just the rebels versus the government, but in reality there's a lot of different factions vying for power. Within the rebels you see a lot of different ideologies, some very secular, some religious extremism. So there's a lot of discrepancy, and my fear, which I'll talk to in a little bit, is that if the rebel groups become successful, which generally could be a good thing, that there might be infighting between the groups and oppression, similar to what happened after the Afghan Civil War. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So just another key facts, Syria is definitely what I call an international playground. You have a lot of different actors there. You got the Russians on one hand, Iran on another, and definitely all the neighboring countries are worried as well, including Israel, and any real country in that area. Even countries not directly bordering it, like Iraq has some ties there, Iran. The sea is definitely an important part. Turkey is definitely heavily involved as well. So just keep in mind with Syria, there's a lot of different players. And it's definitely different from a situation like Libya, given that Syria is smaller geographically than Libya, but more densely populated and with a much greater population. So with that being said, I want to talk about what I think would be good things for the U.S. and other countries to do with regards to Syria, and mistakes that I want the United States and other countries to avoid. So what we have to understand about civil wars of this caliber is they usually tend to follow actually a pretty predictable pattern. And that is it starts off in an ABC order. And this is actually not something I developed, it's something I took from Fareed Zakaria. So it's that in this case, what happens first is situation A. You have a minority group in power, in this case the Alawites, and they are pressing a majority. So this is where the government is cracking down on the regular people. Then you get into part B, which is that this group that's being oppressed, the majority, in turn gets power. And after they get power, they in turn oppress the minority group. This is a very popular progression in civil wars. Most notably, this happened in Rwanda in some form or another. And then the ultimate danger is when you get to part C, is when the majority group is now in power. Not only are they oppressing the minorities out of revenge, but there's also infighting among the group, and it still ends in a pretty much disaster situation. And so this is actually pretty much the case of what happened in Afghanistan. What happened is after the Soviet invasion, this is exactly the pattern that happened. You had this majority against the Soviets that were aligned temporarily, but then you saw a lot of infighting, and at the end, an extreme group came to power, which we now know as the Taliban, and started oppressing the people. So this is a very similar pattern. I feel like if we push too hard on the intervention side, this is what's going to happen. Now, I still think that we definitely need to send as much humanitarian aid as possible, and I'm all for the international community stepping up. But what I am heavily against is the United States involvement for that reason. Right now, there's no real clear side for the U.S. to take part on. The rebels, yeah, they're being oppressed, but there's some of the rebels are oppressing within themselves and could end up hurting the Alawites with our own weapons. We don't want our friends today to become our enemies tomorrow, which happened with the Mujahideen. Again, going back to the Afghanistan example, what we did is the United States actually trained the Mujahideen to fight off the Soviets, giving them resources, and in turn those resources were later used against the United States. There's actually a lot of evidence on this. And in fact, the CIA gave training. If you look deep enough into it, you'll actually see that Osama bin Laden was trained by the CIA or given CIA level tactics all the way back when the whole crisis with the Soviets was at hand. And in turn, some of those tactics were then used against the United States. So this is a very big concern for me. If our goal is to protect American lives, but also that of the Syrian people, we don't want any crazy group to have power, whether it be Bashar al-Assad or some crazy faction of a rebel group. So to me, I take this very seriously. And I think intervention does seem like the moral thing to do, but could have very dangerous consequences. And we have to be aware of the long run, because we can't just think in the short term. And if there is going to be international involvement, if I don't get to have my say and there is some involvement, then what I want to... And this is, of course, outside humanitarian aid. I'm talking military involvement. So if there is some sort of military involvement and they don't heed the advice, which is to not intervene, then I want to see some international support. I don't want to see a unilateral U.S. action. Let other countries take the charge. You know, we always have this idea that we're number one in part because other countries, they're not stepping up to the plate. So let's let them step up to the plate, especially the neighboring countries. The Arab League and other nations need to get more involved. It's, after all, more in their region, it's more in their ballpark, and so let them take care of it and don't have the U.S. solve everyone's problems, especially since there's a lot of corrupting influences at play. And so far, I'm really liking this Russian deal because I feel it's a diplomatic solution and it's going to hopefully lead to the smallest amount of lives being lost. And I could be completely wrong, but I feel like diplomacy at this stage is better than continuing a war and just having shots fired from all sides. So the Syria crisis has a lot of consequences. There's a few things I want to dismiss. First, I don't like this idea that we're dismissing the idea of peace. At least certain members of Congress are saying this. I think that's ridiculous. Okay, so Russia was able to negotiate a peace. Peace is still peace, and that's better than going to war. Cost-benefit analysis. It's not a matter of reputation or Russia looking good. We want to make peace. We do not want to make war. So I don't like the idea that we're dismissing diplomacy simply because it came from the Russians, when any ceasefire and protecting life in Syria is, I think, more important than ever supposed reputation. And another thing I want to dismiss as well is the whole idea of Iran. Iran does have a part to play in Syria, but I would wager that it has a rather small part. Iran is still a relatively weak country. What I don't understand is if we're so powerful and Iran's so weak, why are we so scared of them? I feel like we have no reason to be scared of them. We could talk about their nuclear development on another day, but believe me, the Syrian crisis isn't really a make or break issue for Israel. Whether we intervene, whether the international intervenes, or whether we don't intervene, like I want us not to, Iran is basically going to stay at the same power level, have the same sort of card, so to speak. If you're knowledgeable with poker terms, I think they're still going to hold the same cards. I don't think much is going to change. So hopefully Syria works out well. Ideally, I'd like to see us do what we've been doing, which is a little bit of strength through peace, and that's diplomacy. But if it does, if that doesn't work out and it resumes back to more of a full-scale war, which is still sort of in, I would like to see us only give humanitarian aid. And if that doesn't happen and there has to be military intervention, please let us do it with the international community. Let us have international law behind us. Let us not do a unilateral event, because I think we've just suffered so many bad things due to Iraq and Afghanistan. We just can't take another one. And there's so much that goes into intervention. We always think, we're going to only be there temporarily. But this is real U.S. lives at stake, real soldiers' lives at stake. And I don't want it to become another decade-plus war. So with that, I think that covers the Syria topic. So now I want to move into mass shootings in the United States. So as we all know, there's been a lot of mass shootings in the last few years. And it's been very interesting because I've actually been in the areas where these shootings have taken place at the same time. I guess it's just a little bit of coincidence on my part. to give you a background, I was actually in the town where Gabby Giffords was shot when that incident occurred. So, it was like real time. Had I been in the wrong place, wrong time, it really could have affected me. And the scariest one was, of course, the Navy Yard shooting, because I'm currently a student at American University, which is in D.C., and just geographically, the Navy Yard is only about 7 miles from where I'm living. And it's right by the Nats Stadium. So if I had happened to just go there for whatever reason, there's a large chance, a very large chance I could have been caught up in that, possibly injured, possibly killed. So I take these mass shootings very seriously, in large part because I've been close to some of these shootings, just geographically. So with mass shootings comes the obvious topic of what can we do, and of course the hot topic, gun control. So before I get into that, I just want to let everyone know that if you define mass shootings, I think this was on the Daily Show, but it's also verified by the facts. I think if you define mass shootings as, I think, 3 or more people getting killed, there have been over 100 mass shootings in just the 2013 calendar year alone. That's a lot. Over 100? That's crazy. I'm pretty sure the number's a lot higher, but I know 100 is a good baseline. I know it's definitely higher than that, so I feel safe to say it's been over 100. But it's definitely crazy. And of course, we see the situation in Chicago, where there's a lot of gang violence. And obviously, Michigan, Detroit, and Flint also have a high homicide per capita rate. So what to do about it? So I'm going to start off least controversial to more controversial suggestions. So I'm going to first talk about things that I think we can all agree upon, and then go on to some things which are a little bit more contentious. So here's some things we can agree upon. I think that there needs to be a lot more investment into mental illness funding. I think basically all the sides are on that. Even the NRA is for increase in mental illness funding, and I think that's a important part for a lot of people who have these problems, who couldn't otherwise get help, either because it's too expensive or they're afraid. And if we kind of destigmatize the idea of mental illness and get these people the help they need, hopefully that they themselves are better off, and it also avoids the mass shooting from taking place in the first place. So I think that's a very important part of this dialogue, is mental health. Mental health funding, increasing resources for that. So next I want to talk about gun control. And again, I'm still trying to do the least controversial to most controversial format. The obvious one is background checks. I think this is non-controversial. Just looking at the polls, you see 90% of Americans supporting universal background checks. There really isn't a solid reason against it, because all it does is says criminals can't get guns, which I think even conservatives would agree that's a good thing. And if you actually look at the polling data specifically, even among Republicans, the number is still well above 70% support universal background checks. But of course, our Congress couldn't even pass a watered-down version of the bill. But I don't think that's reflective of the people's will. I think that's just a dysfunctional Congress. And a dysfunctional Congress is definitely something I want to cover in a later podcast. But in more regards to this mass shooting phenomenon, I think universal background checks is a must, and I definitely hope that there is a push from both sides on the aisle to get that passed. Pass a much stronger bill basically saying wherever you sell guns, whether it be a gun show or online, you do have to pass a background check, because with a gun, it's a lot of power. And as cliched as it is, it's true. With great power does come this great responsibility. I mean, it's true. Like, guns, as we saw, have the ability to kill a lot of people in a very small amount of time. And so it's important that we pass universal background checks. So now it's time to get into some of the more controversial solutions. I think the most obvious one that comes up is an assault weapons ban for semi-automatic rifles like an AR-15, which has been used in a lot of the mass shootings. So my thoughts on this are a bit mixed. On one hand, I don't feel like banning this gun will do a substantial amount of reduction in crime, but I do feel like it could be a positive big step. And so I'm a little bit torn myself on whether or not banning guns or semi-automatic rifles is going to be effective. I wouldn't mind having another sunset sort of law, like what happened in 1994. To give some background, there was a assault weapons ban on semi-automatic rifles from, I believe, 1994 to 2004. What happened was, in the law when it was passed, they said that it will expire in 10 years, so it allowed it to only exist for a limited amount of time. And then after when the expiration date came, the country had sort of shifted a little bit more to the right on that issue, and what ended up happening was it wasn't renewed. So then after that, for some purposes, semi-automatic rifles were allowed. So I wouldn't mind having another one of those, something that says, okay, we're going to pass it, but only for a certain amount of time, and seeing what happens. The jury's still out on whether or not the ban that existed in the 90s and early 2000s was effective at reducing crime. But I think having another one, at least for a temporary basis, another weapons ban, could help us just see what's going on. And as for the constitutionality issue, if you look at the Supreme Court cases, District of Columbia, I think it was Heller and McDonald versus Chicago, I forget the exact names, but the courts basically said that yes, the people do have a right to own arms, but that it is also subject to reasonable restrictions. I know in some states you can carry guns into public buildings and schools, and those are more in the deep south states, and I just feel like that's a danger to everyone. Also, I mean, perhaps one of you viewers can clarify, but I don't really understand why there's permits for concealed carry but not open carry. I feel like open carry is actually more safe, and let me give you the reasons why. First, if it's a concealed carry, then you don't know who's packing, and that could be dangerous. You don't know if it's a criminal who's hiding it or just an ordinary citizen with a concealed carry permit. If you have an open carry, an officer can go up and make sure you have a permit. It's right there. Usually if you have an open carry, it's kind of assumed that you are an ordinary civilian. A criminal with even half-brains would conceal their firearm. And also, if the whole idea is to incentivize people to reduce crime, wouldn't you want them to know that you had a gun? So if I was, say, someone who was like, oh, I want to show people I have a gun so that they don't rob me or they don't rob this area, then I would want to make that gun prominent. It wouldn't really do much effect if it was hidden and no one knew I had a gun, if that makes any sense. So I feel like I don't really like the idea of there being permits to carry weapons anyway. I'm more than okay with people having it on their own property for self-defense. But if there is going to be permits to allow people to carry weapons, I feel like open carry makes a whole lot more sense than concealed carry. It demonstrates that you do have a firearm. It's actually visible, so it actually deters crime, if that is your argument. I don't think it does deter crime, but if the whole idea is that having guns deters crime, then I would imagine that entails having the guns visible. It also makes it so that officers can easily see if you do have one and ask for a permit, ensuring that there is legality and that you're not a criminal, among the other things. So that's the talk on mass shootings, and they're all very sad. Oh, and I want to talk about one last thing about mass shootings before we get on to the debt crisis. It's the whole idea of politicizing political shootings. Now, I have a certain definition of politicize, which I think is different from congressmen. Suggesting bills and ideas that you think legitimately would help reduce crime. Now, these ideas might not reduce crime, but as long as if you're being genuine, you're throwing out suggestions saying, look, I want to reduce these shootings. What laws can we pass to do that? I don't consider that politicizing an event. I consider that actually doing the responsible thing and being so angry and distraught at the event that you want to prevent others. So when certain congressmen from the left say that they want to pass some efforts of gun control or some laws or something to help reduce these crimes, I don't like it when the other side says they're politicizing the event. Now, to be fair, if Republicans do offer some suggestions such as the mental illness thing, I expect the same courtesy from the left. But to just say that when you pass off ideas, you're politicizing the event and, oh, you shouldn't talk about it at all, I think that's a lot of BS. I think that if you really care about people getting killed, then you don't want it to happen in the future, and you want to pass laws that are going to help prevent that. And so whenever someone brings up suggestions, that is not politicizing an event. Politicizing an event is sort of taking an event and fitting a certain agenda, but not for the purpose of saving lives. That is to say, so an example of politicizing an event is if you took these shootings and somehow scapegoated it. You blamed it on a certain group, a certain religion, a certain ideology, and saying, oh, this shooter was motivated by this and these people are to blame. That is politicizing an event. I think the best example, obviously, is 9/11 and kind of the discrimination against those who are of Muslim faith or look Arabic, even if they aren't, or Arabic. Sorry, I apologize. That's an example of politicizing an event. Or if you look at the Boston bombing, saying, "Oh, all Chechens are bad," or if you go to really any of the mass shootings, saying it's like a lack of family values. That's just scapegoating. That's blaming a group, an ideology, or whatever in order to politicize an agenda. It's not helping anyone. So there's a difference between saying being against Muslims after 9/11, that's politicizing an event. But if you're saying, I want to pass some gun control so that we can prevent this in the future, I do not consider that politicizing at all. In fact, I feel like that's the obligation of our lawmakers, is to pass laws in order to positively affect the public, and that means reducing these sort of events in the future. With that being said, I want to move on to the third point about the debt ceiling. Before I get there, I just want to add some notes. I hope you appreciate this podcast so far, and please comment. Please comment, message me, whatever it wants. I want this podcast to gain some traction. I really hope you enjoy it, and please also comment about topics that you would like to see me cover in the future, or things you felt I didn't address enough, or things that I perhaps didn't fact check. I should be at least generally good with my facts, but please call me out. I want to make sure that I'm accurate. I'm more than happy to have an engaged debate. If you want to see me cover, again, certain topics, just let me know. And I'll cover this all at the end of the podcast too. But just before I get into the last of the three things and talk about the debt ceiling, I just want you guys to keep that in mind. All right, with that being said, we go on to a more domestic economic issue, and that is the idea of the debt ceiling, the budget crisis. We can kind of just all lump that into the debt crisis or what have you. So far what's happened, last time I checked, is that the House did pass a heavily Republican budget that defunds Obamacare. First of all, isn't it kind of a joke that we voted to repeal Obamacare like over 30 times? Now, granted, I'm all for a debate. Obamacare has a lot of flaws, and to repeal it one or two times, to attempt to do it like even up to 5, okay, that's fine. But really 30 times, it's called Obamacare. Do you really think President Obama is going to veto one of the few things he actually did in office? Like, what is the logic in that? And even if you thought he would pass it, do you really think the Senate is going to go through? Like, seriously, like, the logic is very flawed, even just from a strictly political, I'm not even taking sides, just from a political standpoint. It's the equivalent of Democrat, if, say, like, Reagan passed a bill, let's just call it the Reagan bill, and it's considered like a highlight piece, but there's a lot of animosity against it, and the Democrats tried 30 times to, say, go against this Reagan bill. It would be dumb, and I would be calling out the Democrats like, okay, 30 times is a little bit too much. So, again, I'm trying to be objective. It doesn't matter whether it's the Democrats or Republicans. It's dumb to go after a bill 30 times and waste the resources when there are other bills that are important that should be discussed on the floor, like immigration or gun control. So with that being said, we talk about the debt crisis. So I've always believed that a balanced approach is the best way to do it, and I think most Americans would agree too. It's a combination of tax increases, both from raising some rates on the top 1%. And by top 1%, I don't mean the highest bracket. I feel like we should change the brackets so that there's a bracket of $1 million in income and up, and also $1 million for capital gains, and increase those rates. So I'm not talking about increasing taxes for someone making $100,000 or $200,000 a year. I'm talking for someone making more than $1 million. I think that would be a good help. Eliminating a lot of the deductions and loopholes would also be a positive step. and then cutting spending. Now, everyone likes the idea of cutting spending, but no one wants to cut their spending, There's a lot of bureaucratic waste, to be sure, but there are a lot of good things, and I definitely don't want education or science or the NASA budget to be at all on the chopping block. I would like to see the military on the chopping block because I feel it's only fair. Entitlements, I'm not sure about that. Social Security could be fixed simply by removing the cap. If you don't know what that is, for the Social Security problem, it's expected to be basically bankrupt around the 2030s. But right now, the way it's structured is that you can only be you're capped at like 100. It's like in the $100,000 range somewhere of the income. So, for example, if I made $200,000, I still would only have to pay taxes on the max limit, which let's just say theoretically is $100,000. So, if I made $1 million, again, I'd only have to pay the tax on the $100,000. So, theoretically, this happens in the real world. Someone making $1 million is technically speaking paying less of a percentage of their total income on Social Security than someone making $200,000, which actually makes it in effect a regressive tax. If you just eliminate that cap and say we're going to tax all your income at that rate, so not just the 100,000 cap, but okay, I think the rate is 4 or 6%, one of those, and say okay, if you make $1 million, we'll tax it at 6. If you make 200,000, we'll tax it at 6. I'm not talking about increasing the tax at all, simply by eliminating that cap. And if you actually do the math, and you can easily look this up. If you do that, it makes Social Security last with full benefits. You could actually increase benefits, even adjusted for inflation, and it'll last till 2070, and that's the worst case scenario. So Social Security literally is solved by one step, eliminating the cap. Boom, done. Like, that's how simple the policy is. So let's not let politicians mull it up and make it seem more complicated than it is. Now, what is complicated is Medicare. That is so complicated. Even like a group of congressmen don't fully understand it because there's a lot of things going on. You got the medical profession, you got the budget with Medicare, you got all these different factors involved. I think Medicare is like a very complex thing and definitely needs to be looked in more. And I definitely want to have a podcast on what I think the healthcare system should look like. But I definitely feel like in order to put strategically, in order to get the military budget on the table, Democrats have to put up Medicare. That is a sad fact, but I think like just politically with the current climate, that's the only way it'll work. But Democrats should not bow down at all. Democrats have been giving in way too much. They have to say, we'll put it on the table, but we also have to put tax cuts. Again, it's all about compromise. Again, ideally, I wouldn't like to see Medicare on the table, but do I think that we're going to have a solid budget without it? No, not really. I think the Democrats have already caved so much, but they shouldn't be doing what they've been doing before and just caving in altogether and then not asking for anything in return. That's just a joke. That's not a compromise. I don't like how the Republicans get to ask for whatever they want, but Democrats can't. I feel like that's unfair. Again, balance. Also, when it comes to the debt, I'm going to say something pretty controversial, but hear me out. The debt in itself is pretty much irrelevant. We act like it's so important, but really there's only two factors about the debt that make it important. The nominal amount, saying that there's 17 trillion of debt, doesn't faze me at all. We could have 200 trillion worth of debt, and it still doesn't faze me. Because there's only two things that I care about. And that is, what is the debt to GDP ratio? And the second, how much of the debt is public and how much of the debt is private? And with that, can we print our own money? If you ask yourself those two things, what is the debt to GDP ratio and what is the private to public ratio? Or sorry, not private to public, foreign to domestic ratio. So that is how much of the debt is owned by citizens and how much is owned by other countries. You put those things together, and that's the parameters you have to look like. If you have a low debt to GDP ratio and you have a lot of public debt but not a lot of foreign debt, that is, most of your debt is owed to citizens and not to other countries, and you can print your own money, the debt basically has zero effect on the economy. And don't just take my word. Look at America after World War II to about the 70s. What happened is, yes, after World War II, there was a spike in debt to GDP ratio, but then it went down. So the debt to GDP ratio was pretty low. We printed our own money, and we still have that ability. And what happened was that most of our debt was owned to our citizens, so we could just print it for future, and we didn't have to worry about other countries. So in effect, it had zero impact. And if you actually look over time, the debt itself has never actually caused a financial crisis. Think about that. And now you might be saying, oh, you're wrong. But just think. Okay, the Great Depression happened because of the stock market crash, over speculation, but the government debt wasn't responsible. Like people's individual debt, having credit card debt and buying things they couldn't afford, yes, that was responsible. But the government debt in itself did not cause that. Now think about the 1980 savings and loan crisis. Again, not government debt. Okay, now I want you to go to the 2000 crisis. Again, not government debt. If we go to the Great Recession, it was, again, a lot of different things, a lot of over-speculation and a lot of debt, but that debt was like debt held by companies or by individuals. The government actual debt, not important at all. In fact, I would like someone to comment below if they can think of any example since 1900 where the government debt, again, there's a difference between someone having credit card debt and the actual debt that the government has. So I want someone to, this is a challenge. Think of a crisis in the United States, from 1900 to modern day, where the debt in itself, the government debt in itself, caused a crisis. I'm going to imagine that none of you are going to be able to come up with something. And that's the reason, and that's sort of the reason. So when it comes to the debt, it does matter, but only in regards to your debt to GDP ratio and your foreign to public ratio. Now, granted, there are some more concerns in the modern day for two reasons. Yes, our debt to GDP ratio is rising, and that is a danger. And yes, more of our debt is now held by foreign groups. But I think proportionally, the number is 70-30. So 70 is held by public, the U.S. public, and 30% of our debt is held by foreign countries like China. So this can be easily fixed. If you focus on the GDP aspect and you focus on growth by investing in public infrastructure and everything, your GDP is going to skyrocket a lot more than your debt. In fact, the San Francisco Fed came out with a report that for public infrastructure investments, every $1 spent yields a $2 return. So if you spend a lot of money on public infrastructure, what's going to happen is your debt or your GDP is going to rise mathematically a lot faster than your debt. And what's going to happen is your debt to GDP ratio is going to go down, and that's a good thing. And also with that, if you finance through the United States through printing currency and bonds, also with Fed monetary policy, what's going to happen is you're going to shift a lot of that burden back to the U.S. public if you make sure that the public is the one buying it. And then the U.S. can continue to print money. We have this fear that, printing money is going to lead to like a bad consequences. But in reality, printing money is the way the United States has survived for over 200 years. That's inflation. Inflation has existed since the existence of the United States as more money gets put into the system. It's only a logical step. As long as you're making sure you're not printing too much, that's fine. The way I like to explain inflation and deflation is sort of like eating food. You want to eat a moderate amount. You don't want to eat nothing at all. Inflation, actually having deflation can actually lead to some very bad consequences as well. And that's like analogous to not eating anything. You can't really function. You're hungry. You're not fully nutritional, but you don't want to become overweight either, and that's the problem of overinflation. Right now, I think we actually have an underinflation problem because right now, I think our inflation rate, I want to say, is a little bit, 2 to 4%. It could be actually less a little bit, but we could definitely sacrifice 1 or 2 points of inflation because that can help put more money in the system and hire more people to work. It's all about the balancing ratios between inflation and employment, which is the Fed's sort of dual mandate. So again, There has not been a single crisis in the United States, at least I can think, since 1900, where the government debt in itself has caused the crisis. Now, the crises have caused government debt to go up or down, and World War II definitely was a big government spender, but that didn't cause a crisis per se. And if you actually look at it, if you raise your GDP so much and focus on growth instead of starving the beast, you can actually have a low GDP to debt ratio. And if you make sure that you're printing money and it's bought by Americans, that's good. And printing money is a good thing because you need that. That's how a country survives. So you just got to make sure you don't print too much. And right now, I would argue that we're actually printing too little since our inflation is actually pretty low. And I feel like we're still in a little bit of a lost decade and a little bit of a liquidity trap. If you don't know what a lost decade is, I'm going to explain that in a future podcast. But it basically happened to Japan in the 90s, and I would argue that that's what is currently happening to the United States. With that being said, I think that's going to conclude my podcast. Just on the debt ceiling, I hope that it is raised for the reasons I just read. There's no reason not to do it. As I said, the debt in itself is not a big concern. You just want to make sure your debt to GDP ratio is not high, and you want to make sure most of that debt is public and not foreign. So that is my first podcast. I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, comment below. I want to really get this thing rolling. Ask me what things you want to see in future posts. Just let me know. If I made a factual error, let me know on that. I think I also asked a challenge of you to ask, find a time since 1900 where the government debt in itself has caused a financial crisis. So that's a challenge for any of you out there. With that being said, I think that concludes this podcast. And one last thing, I don't have a name for this podcast yet. So if any of you want to create a name, feel free to submit one. And if I really like it, I think I might choose it. So with that being said, this is the first podcast by Alex Patel covering current events. Have a good day.